In the quiet suburbs of Virginia, where pristine lawns stretched before colonial-style homes, Officer Richard Thompson's seemingly ordinary life was about to take an extraordinary turn. The veteran police officer of 15 years had built a reputation in his precinct as someone who could get things done, though his methods often raised eyebrows among his colleagues. That crisp autumn morning started like any other. Thompson arrived at the station, coffee in hand, nodding to his fellow officers as he made his way to his desk. The familiar weight of his badge felt heavier than usual as he reviewed the day's assignments. Little did he know that his next case would shake the very foundation of his career and challenge everything he thought he knew about power and privilege. A call came in about a suspicious safe discovered during a routine property inspection at an upscale, gated community. Thompson volunteered to handle it, knowing these types of cases often led to interesting findings. He'd developed quite a knack for acquiring valuable items during his investigations, a secret he'd managed to keep well hidden from his superiors. As he drove his patrol car through the tree-lined streets, Thompson mentally calculated how much he might make from whatever was inside the safe. His daughter's college tuition was due soon, and his gambling debts were piling up. He'd convinced himself that taking small items here and there wasn't really hurting anyone, just another perk of the job, he reasoned. The property in question was a stunning two-story house with a perfectly manicured lawn. The real estate agent who'd called it in was waiting outside, nervously checking her watch. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," she said, leading him inside. "We found it while preparing for an open house. The previous owners moved out months ago, and nobody mentioned anything about a safe." Thompson followed her to the master bedroom's walk-in closet, where a sleek black safe sat partially concealed behind a false panel. His heart raced at the sight, high-end model, probably filled with valuables. He dismissed the real estate agent, assuring her he'd handle everything according to protocol. Once alone, Thompson pulled out his special set of tools, the ones that didn't exist in official police records. Years of experience had taught him how to crack safes without leaving obvious signs of forced entry. As he worked on the lock, he imagined the contents: jewelry, cash, maybe even some bonds or gold coins. The safe's mechanism finally yielded with a satisfying click. Thompson's hands trembled slightly as he pulled the heavy door open, his mind already counting the potential windfall. But what he found inside made his blood run cold. Military medals. Numerous prestigious awards. Official documents bearing the seal of the United States Army. And photographs, dozens of them, showing a distinguished-looking black man in a general's uniform at various military ceremonies and White House functions. One photo showed him shaking hands with 3 different presidents. Thompson's throat went dry as he picked up a recent newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Lieutenant General James Richardson takes command of Strategic Operations Division." The same man from the photo stared back at him, now the highest-ranking officer in charge of one of the military's most crucial commands. The reality of what he'd just done hit Thompson like a physical blow. He hadn't just broken into any safe, he'd illegally accessed the private property of a 3-star general. A man who'd dedicated his entire life to serving the country, breaking barriers, and achieving excellence at the highest levels of military leadership. As he sat there surrounded by the evidence of a life devoted to honor and integrity, Thompson felt shame wash over him for the first time in years. The contrast between his own corrupted path and the general's distinguished career was stark and undeniable. Each medal, each commendation, each photograph seemed to stare back at him accusingly. In that moment, Thompson realized he'd reached a crossroads. The safe hadn't contained what he'd expected to find. Instead, it held something far more valuable, a mirror to his own moral decay and an opportunity for redemption. The question was, would he have the courage to face the consequences of his actions and make things right? The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped Thompson back to reality. He quickly glanced out the window and saw an official military vehicle. His heart pounding, he knew the next few moments would determine not just his future, but would test the very essence of his character. The footsteps downstairs echoed through the empty house, each one bringing him closer to a moment of truth he never expected to face. Thompson's police training kicked in as he heard multiple sets of footsteps ascending the stairs. With swift, practiced movements, he began returning the items to the safe, his hands trembling slightly as he handled each metal with newfound reverence. The voices grew closer, one was the real estate agent, and the other, a deep, authoritative tone that seemed to command attention without effort. "The safe should be right in here, sir," the agent's voice carried through the doorway. "Officer Thompson is already examining it as requested." Thompson stood up straight, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight around his collar. As General Richardson stepped into the room, the air seemed to change. There was an unmistakable presence about him that decades of military command had instilled. At 62 years old, he carried himself with the kind of dignity that came from a lifetime of service and sacrifice. The general's eyes moved methodically around the room before settling on Thompson, then the open safe behind him. His expression remained neutral, but there was a sharp intelligence in his gaze that made Thompson feel as if every one of his transgressions was laid bare. "Officer Thompson," the general acknowledged with a slight nod. "I appreciate you responding to the call. I apologize for any confusion. I should have notified the department directly about the safe when we moved, but with the rapid deployment orders." He paused, studying Thompson's face carefully. "I trust everything is in order?" The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Thompson felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. In his 15 years on the force, he'd talked his way out of countless situations, but standing before this man, whose life's achievements he'd just violated, the usual excuses died in his throat. "Sir," Thompson began, his voice steadier than he felt, "I need to be honest with you." The real estate agent shifted uncomfortably by the door, sensing the tension in the room. "Could we speak privately?" The general nodded to the agent, who quickly excused herself. Once alone, Thompson took a deep breath and continued, "I didn't just find this safe, sir. I broke into it. And I did it with the intention of stealing whatever I found inside." The silence that followed was deafening. General Richardson's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he processed the confession. Thompson pressed on, the words tumbling out now that he'd started. "When I saw what was actually inside, your medals, your achievements, everything you've worked for, I realized just how far I've fallen." Thompson's voice cracked slightly. "I've been using my badge to take advantage of situations like this for years. But standing here, looking at the evidence of a life dedicated to real service." He gestured to the safe. "I can't do it anymore." The general moved to the safe, examining its contents with careful precision. His fingers traced over a particular medal, the Distinguished Service Cross, before he turned back to Thompson. "Do you know what this medal represents, officer?" Thompson shook his head. "I received this for an operation in Baghdad, 1991. My unit was pinned down, taking heavy fire. I had two choices, retreat to safety or risk everything to save 3 wounded soldiers." The general's voice carried the weight of memory. "The easy choice isn't always the right one, Officer Thompson. But the right choice, no matter how difficult, is always worth making." He closed the safe door with a gentle click. "You had a similar choice today. You chose truth over deception, accountability over escape. That's a start." Thompson felt a mix of shame and relief wash over him. "I'll turn in my badge, sir. Report myself to Internal Affairs first thing tomorrow." "No," the general's response was firm. "You'll do it today. Right now. I'll accompany you to the station." Thompson blinked in surprise. "Sir, you don't need to dash." "When I was coming up through the ranks," the general interrupted, "I faced obstacles that had nothing to do with my abilities and everything to do with people's preconceptions. But I also encountered those who believed in redemption, in the power of facing our mistakes and learning from them. They gave me chances I might not have had otherwise. He stepped closer to Thompson, his presence both commanding and compassionate. Your career in law enforcement may be over, but your story doesn't have to end here. Sometimes our greatest failures can lead to our most important contributions, if we're willing to do the hard work of earning back trust. The drive to the police station was the longest 20 minutes of Thompson's life. The general followed in his military vehicle, his presence in the rearview mirror a constant reminder of the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Thompson thought about his daughter, how he'd always told her that integrity mattered above all else, while his own actions had betrayed those very words. As they walked into the station together, conversations halted and heads turned. The sight of a 3-star general accompanying one of their own officers created an immediate stir. Thompson's partner, Detective Rodriguez, approached with a questioning look, but stopped short when he saw Thompson's expression. "I need to speak with the chief," Thompson said, his voice carrying across the now quiet room. "And someone from Internal Affairs." The general stood silently beside him, his presence lending in gravity to the moment that no one could ignore. As Thompson watched his chief's office door open, he felt something unexpected, not relief, exactly, but a sense of purpose. He was about to lose everything he'd worked for, but for the first time in years, he was doing something he could be proud of. The next few hours would change not just his life, but potentially the lives of others affected by his past actions. There would be investigations, accusations, and consequences he couldn't yet imagine. But as he stepped forward to face the truth, Thompson understood what the general had meant about choices. Sometimes the hardest path forward is the only one worth taking. The next few hours in Chief Henderson's office felt like an eternity. Thompson sat facing his superior officers and an internal affairs investigator, systematically detailing years of misconduct. Each confession seemed to age him, the weight of his actions visible in the deepening lines on his face. General Richardson remained present, his steady presence a reminder of why Thompson had chosen this path. 7 years, Thompson said, his voice hoarse from talking. It started with a jewelry box during a domestic disturbance call. The homeowner had already filed the insurance claim, assumed it was taken during the break-in. I told myself it didn't matter, that no one would miss it. He paused, running his hands over his face. After that, it got easier. Chief Henderson, a 30-year veteran of the force, sat behind his desk, his expression a mix of disappointment and controlled anger. The internal affairs investigator, Agent Chen, typed rapidly on her laptop, documenting every detail. The room felt thick with tension. "And today?" Chief Henderson asked, his voice carefully measured. "What made this time different?" Thompson glanced at General Richardson before answering. "I opened that safe expecting to find valuables. Instead, I found something worth more than money, a lifetime of honor and service. It made me see myself clearly for the first time in years." He straightened in his chair. "I'm prepared to help recover everything I can, make restitution wherever possible." Agent Chen looked up from her laptop. "You understand this will trigger a full investigation? Every case you've handled will need to be reviewed. Other officers may come under scrutiny if there's any indication they knew or were involved." "I understand," Thompson nodded. "I worked alone, but I know this will cast doubt on everyone. They don't deserve that. The department doesn't deserve that." General Richardson, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. "Chief Henderson, if I may?" At the chief's nod, he continued, "What Officer Thompson did was inexcusable. But his voluntary confession and willingness to make amends deserves consideration. In my experience, true accountability can have a broader impact than punishment alone." The chief leaned back in his chair, studying Thompson. "Why should we believe this isn't just an attempt to get ahead of being caught? How do we know you're truly remorseful?" Thompson reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is my daughter's college acceptance letter. She got into her dream school last week. His voice wavered slightly. "I've been taking things to pay for her tuition, telling myself I was doing it for her. But what kind of legacy is that? What kind of example?" He placed his badge and gun on the chief's desk. "She deserves better. This department deserves better." The revelation of Thompson's crimes sent shockwaves through the precinct. Officers gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones as internal affairs investigators set up in a conference room. Detective Rodriguez stood by his desk, still processing the fact that his partner of 5 years had led a double life. Outside the chief's office, Thompson's daughter Lisa arrived, confusion and concern evident on her face. She'd received a cryptic call from her father asking her to come to the station immediately. As Thompson emerged from the office, their eyes met, and he saw the moment she realized something was terribly wrong. "Dad?" Her voice was small, uncertain. "What's going on?" Thompson guided her to a quiet corner, aware of the eyes following them. "Sweetheart, I need to tell you something, and it's going to be hard to hear." He took a deep breath, remembering the general's words about facing the truth. "I've done things, wrong things, that I tried to justify because they were for you. But I was lying to myself, and now I have to make it right." As he explained, Lisa's expressions shifted from confusion to shock to disappointment. Tears welled in her eyes, but she held them back, showing a strength that reminded Thompson of her mother. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "The tuition money," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was stolen?" Thompson nodded, unable to speak. Lisa stood up abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself. "I'll withdraw my acceptance. Get a job instead." "No," General Richardson's voice came from behind them. He'd approached quietly, carrying himself with the same dignified presence that had so affected Thompson earlier. "Young lady, may I speak with you for a moment?" Lisa nodded, wiping her eyes quickly. The general led her a few steps away, speaking in low tones. Thompson couldn't hear their conversation, but he saw his daughter's posture gradually change, saw her nod several times, even manage a small smile. When they returned, Lisa's eyes were clearer, more determined. "Dad, I'm going to stay with Aunt Susan for a while. I need time to process this." She hugged him briefly, stiffly. "But I'm not giving up on school." General Richardson explained some things about mistakes and redemption. About how what matters most is what we do after we fail. Thompson watched his daughter leave, feeling both heartbroken and oddly hopeful. The general placed a hand on his shoulder. "She's stronger than you think. Sometimes our children learn their most important lessons from our failures, not our successes." As the day drew to a close, Thompson sat with Agent Chen, beginning the lengthy process of documenting every incident he could remember. Each confession felt like removing a weight he'd carried for years, though he knew the hardest parts were still to come. There would be criminal charges, restitution hearings, and the long process of rebuilding trust with his daughter. But as he looked around the station that had been his second home for 15 years, Thompson understood that ending this chapter of his life was the only way to begin a new one. The path ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, it would be honest. The investigation into Thompson's activities unfolded like a slow-moving earthquake, sending aftershocks through the entire police department. 3 weeks after his confession, the conference room had transformed into a command center for internal affairs. Boxes of case files lined the walls, each containing potential evidence of Thompson's misdeeds. Agent Chen had developed a system, methodically tracking down every case Thompson had handled. She'd placed different colored sticky notes on each file, green for clean cases, yellow for suspicious circumstances, and red for confirmed theft. The red notes were becoming disturbingly common. "We've identified 12 more victims," she reported during a morning briefing with Chief Henderson. "Most of them assumed their valuables were taken by the original perpetrators. They never suspected." She trailed off, shaking her head. The chief stood at the window, watching officers arrive for the morning shift. How are the officers handling it? Morale is low, Agent Chen admitted. Some feel betrayed, others are angry about being questioned. Detective Rodriguez has been especially helpful, reviewing old cases where he and Thompson worked together. Outside the station, life continued its strange new rhythm. Thompson spent his days meeting with his lawyer, preparing for the inevitable criminal charges. His nights were spent writing detailed accounts of every theft he could remember, trying to ensure that everything stolen could be traced and, hopefully, returned. The story had made its way to the local news, though thankfully without many details. Still, the headlines were damaging enough: veteran officer confesses to years of theft. Police department under investigation. Trust in local law enforcement shaken. One morning, Thompson sat in his lawyer's office, reviewing the growing list of charges he would likely face. The gravity of his situation was written in black and white before him: multiple counts of theft, abuse of power, evidence tampering. His lawyer, Mrs. Patel, spoke frankly about potential plea agreements and jail time. The DA's office is willing to consider your voluntary confession and cooperation, she explained, adjusting her reading glasses. But they're under pressure to make an example of this case. The integrity of the entire department is being questioned. Thompson nodded, his mind drifting to the previous evening when he tried to call Lisa. She still wasn't taking his calls, though his sister Susan assured him she was doing well in school. The distance hurt, but he understood it was part of the price he had to pay. A knock at the office door interrupted their discussion. To Thompson's surprise, General Richardson entered, carrying a manila envelope. "I hope I'm not interrupting," the general said, nodding to Mrs. Patel. "I have something that might be relevant to this case." The envelope contained statements from several of Thompson's former colleagues and supervisors. They detailed instances where Thompson had gone above and beyond to help others, times when he'd shown exceptional dedication to the community. There were even letters from citizens he'd helped over the years. "This doesn't excuse what you did," the general explained, "but it shows a more complete picture. People aren't just their worst mistakes." Mrs. Patel reviewed the documents with interest. These could be helpful during sentencing. Show that rehabilitation is possible, that there's support for a path forward. Later that afternoon, Thompson found himself back at the police station, helping Agent Chen piece together another case. As they worked, Detective Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, his expression troubled. "You need to see this," Rodriguez said, placing a file on the table. "Remember that jewelry store robbery from last year? I've been reviewing the evidence logs, and something doesn't add up." Thompson felt his stomach sink as Rodriguez explained. The case had seemed straightforward, a smash-and-grab robbery with most of the stolen items recovered. Except now, comparing the initial inventory with what was logged into evidence, there were discrepancies. "The thing is," Rodriguez continued, his voice low, "these inconsistencies, they're not your style. You always worked alone, kept it small scale. This looks like something bigger." Agent Chen quickly grasped the implications. "You think there might be other officers involved? A separate operation?" Thompson studied the file, memories of that case flooding back. He'd noticed things that hadn't seemed right at the time, but he'd been so focused on his own misdeeds that he'd ignored them. The irony wasn't lost on him: his own corruption had made him turn a blind eye to potentially bigger problems. "I remember that case," he said slowly. "There were some unusual procedures, things that didn't follow standard protocol. I didn't question it because..." He paused, shame coloring his words, "because I was worried about drawing attention to myself." The revelation added another layer to the investigation. Agent Chen immediately began pulling related cases, looking for patterns. Thompson found himself in the strange position of helping to uncover corruption while facing consequences for his own. That evening, as Thompson left the station, he found General Richardson waiting in the parking lot. The older man had become an unexpected constant in this upheaval, appearing at crucial moments with guidance or support. "Walk with me," the general suggested. As they moved through the cooling evening air, he continued, "You know, in the military, we have a saying, mission first, people always. It means while we focus on the objective, we never forget the human cost." Thompson understood the parallel. His confession had started something larger than himself, potentially exposing systemic issues within the department. But at its core, this was about people, those he'd wronged, those who trusted him, and those who might be helped by the truth finally coming to light. "I've been thinking about what comes after," Thompson admitted. "Assuming I serve time, which seems likely. What then? How do you rebuild when you've destroyed so much trust?" The general was quiet for a moment, considering. "You rebuild the same way you tear down, one piece at a time. But this time, you lay each brick with integrity, with purpose. It's not quick, and it's never easy, but it's possible." As they reached Thompson's car, a text message lit up his phone. It was from Lisa. "Dad, can we meet tomorrow? I'm ready to talk." Thompson showed the message to the general, who smiled slightly. "See? Sometimes the first step toward rebuilding comes when you least expect it, but exactly when you need it most." The small coffee shop where Thompson waited for Lisa was quiet in the mid-morning lull. He'd arrived 30 minutes early, his hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee, watching the door with equal parts hope and anxiety. The place had been their special spot once, weekend breakfasts, after-school conversations, celebrations of small victories. Now it felt like neutral ground, a safe space for difficult truths. When Lisa walked in, Thompson almost didn't recognize her. 6 weeks had changed her somehow. She carried herself differently, more guarded but also more determined. She ordered her drink before joining him, and he noticed she'd chosen a table with clear sight lines to both exits, a habit she'd picked up from him over the years. "You look well," he started, then immediately regretted the generic opening. "Aunt Susan's been great," Lisa replied, stirring her coffee unnecessarily. "She's helping me apply for scholarships, since." She left the sentence unfinished, but its meaning hung between them. Thompson leaned forward slightly. "Lisa, about school. General Richardson mentioned Dash." "He's been mentoring me," she interrupted, meeting his eyes for the first time. "Did you know he teaches a leadership seminar at the university? He invited me to sit in." A small smile crossed her face. "He says I have a natural talent for strategic thinking." The revelation surprised Thompson, though perhaps it shouldn't have. The general's influence had extended beyond his own redemption story, reaching out to help his daughter find her footing in the aftermath of his confession. "Dad," Lisa continued, her voice stronger now, "I need to understand something. All those times you talked to me about integrity, about doing the right thing, was any of it real?" The question hit him like a physical blow, but he forced himself to hold her gaze. "It was all real. Everything I taught you about right and wrong came from what I used to believe, what I still believe deep down. I just failed to live up to those principles myself." Before Lisa could respond, Thompson's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Chen, "Major breakthrough in jewelry store case. Need you at the station ASAP." Lisa noticed his distraction. "Work?" she asked, then caught herself. "I mean, the investigation?" Thompson hesitated, torn between his daughter and his obligation to help with the case. Lisa made the decision for him. "Go. We can meet again next week." I'm not ready to forgive everything, but I'm trying to understand." At the station, Agent Chen's conference room had transformed into something resembling a war room. Detective Rodriguez stood before a large whiteboard covered in names, dates, and connecting lines. Chief Henderson was there, along with 2 FBI agents Thompson hadn't seen before. "The jewelry store robbery was just the tip of the iceberg," Agent Chen explained as Thompson entered. "We've uncovered what appears to be an organized network operating within multiple precincts. Officers working with professional thieves, coordinating heists, manipulating evidence. Rodriguez pointed to several names on the board. These officers all worked specialized units: evidence handling, property crimes, internal affairs. They had the perfect cover to make things disappear. Thompson studied the names, recognizing several. Some had been on the force longer than him, respected veterans with spotless records. How did no one notice? People did notice, one of the FBI agents spoke up. But complaints were buried, witnesses were intimidated, and anyone who pushed too hard found themselves transferred or forced into early retirement. The scale of corruption made Thompson's own crimes seem almost quaint in comparison. While he'd been stealing from crime scenes opportunistically, these officers had built an entire shadow operation. "We need your help," Chief Henderson said, his voice grave. "You worked alongside some of these officers. You might have seen things, details that seemed insignificant at the time but could be important now." Thompson spent the next several hours going through old case files, his memory sharpened by the need to make amends. He recalled oddities in evidence processing, unusual patterns in patrol assignments, conversations that had seemed innocent at the time but now carried darker implications. As evening approached, General Richardson arrived at the station, having been briefed on the expanding investigation. He found Thompson in the break room, staring out the window at the gathering dusk. "Your daughter called me," the general said, joining him at the window. "She mentioned your conversation." Thompson turned, surprised. "She did?" The general nodded. "She's struggling with something I've seen many soldiers face, reconciling the person they thought they knew with a different reality. But she's strong, and more importantly, she wants to understand." "I keep thinking about that safe," Thompson admitted. "If I hadn't opened it that day, if I hadn't seen your medals, none of this would be coming to light. The corruption would continue, Lisa would still believe in a lie, and I'd still be." He trailed off. "Sometimes the greatest acts of courage don't look heroic at first," the general replied. "Sometimes they look like failure, like confession, like facing the truth even when it costs us everything we thought we wanted." A commotion in the main office interrupted their conversation. Agent Chen appeared in the doorway, her expression urgent. "We just got authorization for surveillance on 3 of our primary suspects. Rodriguez thinks they're planning something big, possibly within the next 48 hours. Thompson straightened, ready to help. But the general placed a hand on his shoulder, stopping him. "Before you go back in there, call your daughter. Tell her you're proud of how she's handling this, and that you understand she needs time. Some battles can wait, others need to be fought right now." As Thompson reached for his phone, he realized that amid all the chaos of the investigation, amid the unraveling of years of corruption, the most important rebuilding was happening in small moments like these: a conversation with his daughter, a step toward redemption, a choice to face the truth no matter the cost. The surveillance operation headquarters had been set up in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. FBI technicians monitored banks of computers while Agent Chen coordinated with various teams in the field. Thompson sat at a desk reviewing personnel files of the officers under investigation, looking for patterns he might have missed. "They're moving," Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio. He'd been tracking Officer Walsh, a 20-year veteran who headed the Evidence Control Unit. "Subject is heading east on Morrison Street, driving a black SUV." Thompson remembered Walsh, a seemingly by-the-book officer who'd always emphasized proper procedure. Now, looking back, Thompson realized those same procedures had provided perfect cover for the corruption ring's activities. Walsh's insistence on handling certain evidence personally, his careful documentation that looked thorough but actually obscured key details, it all made sense now. "Second target is mobile," another surveillance team reported. Detective Harris just left Central Precinct, carrying a large briefcase. "Not standard issue." Chief Henderson, who'd been quietly observing the operation, moved closer to the monitors. Harris was in charge of 3 major jewelry store investigations last year. All had unexplained evidence discrepancies. Thompson pulled Harris's case files, spreading them across his desk. He'd worked with Harris on one of those cases, a sophisticated heist that had supposedly been solved, though now Thompson noticed details that hadn't added up. The recovered jewelry had been slightly different from what was stolen, but the differences were subtle enough that only someone familiar with the original pieces would notice. "Sir," a young FBI analyst called out, "we've got movement at the storage facility on Industrial Drive. 2 more subjects just arrived, Officers Bennett and Cruz." The pieces started falling into place in Thompson's mind. "The storage facility," he said, standing up. "That's where they're staging everything. Look at these evidence logs, items being transferred between precincts always routed through that facility. They've been using it as a switching station." Agent Chen quickly pulled up satellite imagery of the facility. Multiple entry points, minimal security cameras, and direct access to the highway. Perfect for their operation. As the teams monitored the gathering suspects, Thompson's phone buzzed. It was a text from Lisa, "Got the first scholarship offer today. Full ride. Can we talk later?" Despite the tension of the operation, Thompson felt a surge of pride and relief. He quickly typed back, "That's amazing, sweetheart. So proud of you. We'll call as soon as I can." "They're unloading something from Harris's car," Rodriguez reported, bringing Thompson's attention back to the operation. "Large cases being moved into Storage Unit 23. Chief Henderson leaned over the radio. "All units hold positions. We need to catch them in the act. If we move too soon, we risk losing the entire network." The next few hours were a lesson in patience. The surveillance teams watched as more players arrived at the storage facility. Through high-powered cameras, they observed the suspects moving various containers between units, checking documents, making calls. General Richardson arrived during the evening shift change, having been kept informed of the operation's progress. He found Thompson staring at the surveillance feeds, lost in thought. "Quite different from your solo operations," the general observed, no judgment in his voice. Thompson nodded. "I kept things small, told myself it minimized the damage. But watching this, I was part of the system that allowed this to happen. Every time I looked the other way to protect myself, I helped them too. Recognition of our role in larger problems is crucial," the general said. "But so is using that knowledge to create change." Their conversation was interrupted by sudden activity on the monitors. Multiple vehicles were arriving at the storage facility, expensive cars with darkened windows. Agent Chen quickly zoomed in on the new arrivals. "Those aren't police vehicles," she said, tapping commands into her computer. "Running plates now." The results caused a stir in the command center. The vehicles belonged to known associates of a major crime syndicate. The corruption wasn't just within the department, it extended to organized crime connections. "All units, stand by," Chief Henderson ordered. "We need to identify everyone involved before we move." Thompson watched the scene unfold, recognizing the gravity of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just about stolen property anymore, this was about the systematic corruption of the justice system itself. His phone buzzed again, another text from Lisa. "General Richardson told me what you're doing, helping with the investigation. Be careful, Dad." The message touched something deep in Thompson's heart. Despite everything, despite his failures and mistakes, his daughter still cared about his safety. It was a small thing, but it felt like a tiny bridge being rebuilt. "Movement at the main entrance," Rodriguez reported urgently. "They're bringing out multiple cases. Looks like they're preparing for transport." Agent Chen consulted with the FBI team leaders. "If they split up with the merchandise, we risk losing crucial evidence. We need to move soon." Chief Henderson made the call. All units prepare to move on my mark. Remember, these are armed law enforcement officers. They know our tactics, our procedures. Be ready for anything. As the teams got into position, General Richardson placed a hand on Thompson's shoulder. You've helped expose something much bigger than yourself. Whatever happens next, remember that. Thompson nodded, watching the surveillance feeds as the operation reached its critical moment. He thought about his own journey, from a corrupt officer stealing from crime scenes to someone helping to expose a vast criminal enterprise. The irony wasn't lost on him. All units, Chief Henderson's voice was steady, on my mark. The command center fell silent, every person focused on their roles in what was about to unfold. Thompson sent one last text to Lisa, "Love you, sweetheart. We'll talk soon." Then he turned his full attention to the monitors, ready to help bring down the corrupt system he had once been part of. The next few moments would determine not just the success of the operation, but the future of the department itself. As Thompson watched the pieces move into place, he realized that true redemption wasn't just about facing your own mistakes, it was about helping to right the larger wrongs those mistakes had helped conceal. The raid unfolded like a choreographed dance, each team moving with precise coordination. Thompson watched from the command center as tactical units surrounded the storage facility. Through the surveillance feeds, he could see Officer Walsh speaking with the crime syndicate representatives, completely unaware of the net closing around them. "All units in position," crackled the radio. Chief Henderson took a deep breath, then gave the command, "Execute." The next few minutes were controlled chaos. FBI teams breached the facility from multiple entry points while police units blocked all possible escape routes. The suspects' reactions told their own story. The criminal associates reached for weapons, but the corrupt officers showed their true colors in different ways. Walsh immediately surrendered, his face a mask of resignation. Detective Harris tried to run but was quickly cornered. Officer Bennett attempted to destroy evidence, frantically trying to open one of the storage units before being tackled by an FBI agent. Multiple subjects in custody, came the reports. Evidence secured. Area contained. But amid the success of the operation, something went wrong. Officer Cruz, backed into a corner, pulled out his service weapon. Instead of surrendering, he turned toward the storage unit containing their documentation. "He's going to destroy the evidence," Thompson shouted, recognizing the desperate look in Cruz's eyes. Without thinking, Thompson grabbed a radio and keyed into Cruz's frequency. "Cruz, this is Thompson," he said, his voice steady despite the tension. "Think about what you're doing. Think about your family." There was a moment of static, then Cruz's voice came through, bitter and angry. "Thompson? The rat who started all this? You've got some nerve." "You're right," Thompson replied, watching Cruz's movements on the monitor. "I am a rat. I betrayed my badge, just like you did. But I'm trying to make it right. You can too." "Make it right?" Cruz laughed harshly. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into. This goes deeper than you know. People will die if this comes out." Thompson caught General Richardson's eye, who nodded encouragingly. "Then help us protect them," Thompson continued. "Whatever you're involved in, whatever threats you're under, we can help. But not if you destroy that evidence." The next 30 seconds felt like hours. Cruz stood frozen, weapon still raised, while tactical teams maintained their positions. Finally, his shoulders slumped. The gun clattered to the ground. As Cruz was taken into custody, the full scope of the operation became clear. The storage units contained not just stolen goods, but detailed records of the corruption network, names, dates, payoff amounts. The corrupt officers hadn't just been stealing, they'd been providing protection and intelligence to organized crime figures, compromising investigations, and even facilitating drug shipments through police-controlled areas. "My God," Chief Henderson muttered, reviewing the initial evidence logs. This goes back at least a decade. Multiple departments, federal cases. Thompson felt a strange mix of emotions as he watched the arrests continue. These were officers he'd worked with, people he'd respected. Some had families, children, just like him. The parallels weren't lost on him. His phone buzzed, another text from Lisa, just saw the news about a major police raid. Are you okay? Before he could respond, Agent Chen called him over to one of the evidence tables. Among the seized documents was a familiar name, Thompson's former sergeant, who'd retired 5 years ago. The same sergeant who'd caught Thompson making a minor error early in his career but had chosen to handle it internally. He knew about me, Thompson realized aloud. He saw my potential for corruption and instead of reporting it, he let it slide. Maybe even encouraged it. They probably saw you as a potential recruit, General Richardson suggested, examining the documents. Your small-scale thefts might have been a test, seeing if you could be trusted with bigger operations. The thought made Thompson feel ill. How close had he come to being fully drawn into their web? If he hadn't opened that safe, if he hadn't seen those medals. As the night progressed, more details emerged. The corruption network had tentacles reaching into police departments across 3 states. Some officers had been willing participants, others had been coerced through blackmail or threats to their families. Around midnight, Lisa arrived at the command center, escorted by Agent Chen. She'd been worried after seeing the news and hearing nothing from her father. When she saw Thompson, she didn't hesitate, she ran to him and hugged him tightly. I was so scared, she whispered. When I saw the raid on the news, and then you weren't answering. Thompson held his daughter, feeling the tremors running through her body. I'm okay, he assured her. Everything's okay. General Richardson watched the reunion with a slight smile. Sometimes, he said quietly, it takes losing everything to find out what we really have. As father and daughter separated, Lisa noticed the evidence scattered across the tables. All this is what you've been working on? Thompson nodded. Remember when you asked if all those talks about integrity were real? This is me trying to live up to those words finally. It doesn't erase what I did wrong, but it's a start, Lisa finished for him. She looked around the command center, taking in the organized chaos of the operation. Dad, I've been thinking. Maybe I could help. With my scholarship, I'm planning to study criminal justice. General Richardson thinks I could make a difference. The revelation stunned Thompson. His daughter, inspired by his fall and redemption, wanted to pursue a career in law enforcement. The irony might have been funny if it wasn't so profound. As the night wound down, Thompson sat with Lisa in the break room, sharing a quiet moment amid the ongoing operation. Through the window, they could see the evidence teams still processing the scene, the lights of police vehicles painting the night in red and blue. I'm still angry sometimes, Lisa admitted, clutching a cup of cold coffee. About what you did, about the lies. But I'm also proud. Proud that you chose to make it right, even knowing what it would cost. Thompson reached for his daughter's hand. I'm proud of you too. For not letting my mistakes define your future. For finding your own way to make things right. Outside, the investigation would continue for months. There would be trials, testimonies, and more revelations. The corruption network's exposure would shake law enforcement to its core. But in that moment, sitting with his daughter, Thompson understood something the general had been trying to teach him: redemption wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And sometimes, the most important steps on that journey weren't the grand gestures, but the quiet moments of truth between father and daughter. 6 months after the raid, Thompson sat in the courthouse corridor, adjusting his tie nervously. The criminal trials had begun, and today he would testify against his former colleagues. The morning news had called it the largest police corruption case in state history, with over 30 officers indicted across multiple jurisdictions. Lisa sat beside him, reviewing her notes. She'd started her criminal justice program and was using the trials as a case study for one of her classes. The way she absorbed every detail of the legal proceedings reminded Thompson of himself at her age, before he'd lost his way. "Ready?" General Richardson appeared, wearing his full-dress uniform. He'd been called to testify about the safe incident that had started it all. Thompson nodded, standing. "As ready as I'll ever be." Inside the courtroom, Thompson faced his former colleagues. Officer Walsh sat with his attorney, looking aged beyond his years. Detective Harris stared straight ahead, refusing to make eye contact. Officer Cruz, who had ultimately agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, offered a slight nod of acknowledgement. As Thompson took the stand, he felt the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. Under questioning, he detailed not just the corruption he'd uncovered, but his own crimes as well. His voice remained steady as he described his years of theft, the safe that changed everything, and his decision to confess. "And why did you choose to come forward?" the prosecutor asked. Thompson glanced at the general, then at his daughter. "Because I realized that integrity isn't just about following rules. It's about facing the truth, even when that truth shows us at our worst. Sometimes, especially then." During cross-examination, the defense attorneys tried to discredit him, painting him as a criminal seeking leniency. But Thompson's honesty about his own failings proved more powerful than their attacks. He hadn't asked for immunity, hadn't tried to minimize his role. He'd accepted the consequences of his actions while working to expose the larger corruption. During a break in the proceedings, Thompson found himself in the courthouse cafeteria with Cruz, both under supervision of federal marshals. The awkward encounter broke when Cruz spoke first. "My kid started college this fall," Cruz said quietly. "After everything came out, I thought she'd never speak to me again. But last week, she told me she was proud. Proud that I finally chose to cooperate, to tell the truth." He looked at Thompson. "Guess we both learned it's never too late to try to do right." The trials continued for weeks. One by one, the corrupt officers were convicted. The evidence recovered from the storage facility proved devastating, detailed records of bribes, theft operations, and collaboration with organized crime. The criminal syndicate's leadership faced even longer sentences. Thompson's own sentencing was scheduled for the following month. His cooperation had been noted by prosecutors, but he still faced significant jail time. The night before his hearing, he sat with Lisa on their old porch swing. "I've been thinking about names," Lisa said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Names?" "For the anti-corruption initiative I'm developing for my thesis. General Richardson is helping me design it. It's about creating better oversight systems, supporting officers who want to report misconduct." She paused. "I was thinking of calling it the SAFE program." Thompson felt tears prick his eyes. His daughter had taken his greatest shame and was transforming it into something that could help prevent others from making the same mistakes. The next morning, Thompson stood before the judge, ready to receive his sentence. The courtroom was packed, journalists, law enforcement, and family members of those involved in the case. General Richardson sat in his dress uniform, while Lisa clutched her notebook, documenting everything. "Mr. Thompson," the judge began, "your crimes are serious. You betrayed your badge and the public trust. However, your voluntary confession and subsequent cooperation led to the exposure of a corruption network that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. You chose truth when it would have been easier to remain silent." The sentence was 5 years, with possibility of parole after 3. As Thompson was led away, he caught a final glimpse of Lisa. She wasn't crying, instead, she sat straight-backed, proud even in this difficult moment. The general stood beside her, a steadying presence. 3 years later, Thompson walked out of prison into the bright morning sun. Lisa was waiting, now a graduate student working on implementing her SAFE program in police departments across the state. General Richardson stood beside her, his hair a little grayer but his bearing as dignified as ever. "Welcome home, Dad," Lisa said, hugging him tightly. As they drove away from the prison, Thompson noticed they weren't heading to his sister's house as planned. Instead, they pulled up at the police academy, where a group of cadets was gathering for a lecture. "I hope you don't mind," Lisa said, "but I thought you might want to join us. I'm giving a presentation on ethical decision-making in law enforcement." General Richardson thought. She hesitated, "Thought you might have something to contribute to the discussion." Thompson looked at the young faces of the cadets, so much like he had been at their age. Full of ideals, ready to serve. He thought about all the choices that had led him astray, and the one choice, facing the truth about himself, that had led him back. "Your story matters," the general said quietly. "Not just the fall, but the redemption. These young officers need to understand both." As Thompson followed his daughter into the academy, he remembered that moment in front of the safe, when he'd seen the general's medals and felt the first crack in his corrupted worldview. He hadn't known then that rock bottom would become his foundation, that his greatest failure would lead to his most meaningful contribution. Lisa began her presentation, describing the SAFE program's mission to support ethical policing. As Thompson listened to his daughter speak with passion about integrity and accountability, he understood something profound. Redemption wasn't just about making amends for the past, it was about creating a better future, even if you wouldn't be the one to see it fully realized. The general's words from so long ago echoed in his mind, "Sometimes the greatest acts of courage don't look heroic at first." Thompson looked at the cadets, at his daughter, at the future of law enforcement they represented. His story wasn't over, it had simply become part of something larger, something that might help others choose right where he had once chosen wrong. And in that moment, Thompson felt truly free, not just from prison, but from the weight of who he had been. The safe that had started it all had contained more than medals and memories. It had contained the key to his redemption, and through that redemption, a chance to help protect the values he had once betrayed.